right, great. So yes, as I was saying, welcome to this webinar that will be introducing our new research project, which is called From Feed the Birds to Do Not Feed the Animals, and it's funded by Wellcome Trust. I've put some details here about our Twitter account, and I'd urge you to follow it, because at the moment, the project, whilst it's technically started, due to COVID, it's taking a little while for us to get everything moving. We don't have a website. So at the moment, our Twitter account will be the thing that we're sharing most of our information through. So my name's Naomi Sykes, and I'm going to be kind of chairing, if you like, this session. But my collaborators, who I will introduce you to in a minute, I'll be throwing to them throughout the course of this webinar. So just to start, I think, as I sent in the joining instructions, we're suggesting that everybody keeps their cameras and mics off just for various reasons. And we're going to use the chat function if you want to ask questions. Stuart Black, who's one of the co-Is, is going to be dealing with and chairing the chat function. Stuart, do you want to just walk people through how the chat function works, just in case?
Sure, thanks, Naomi. The chat function, you should be able to see that at the bottom part of the screen. Sometimes you might, if you're on full view, you might have to go up to the options and exit the full view before you can then see all the function elements. But you should have mute, video, participants, and chat, the chat function at the bottom. If you click on the chat, the chat will open on the right-hand side, and you can then type in your questions, and it should be fairly straightforward. Ask anything that you like, and we'll try and get the answers to you, and we'll just sort of pull them together towards the end. But Naomi will go through that.
Cool. Okay, so let's start with testing the chat function. So we'll do that with just a really easy poll by asking you, do you feed birds? And you can just put in the chat function yes or no. And so we're already doing some citizen science research here, so you can tell us whether or not you're a bird feeder. Oh, it looks like we're getting lots of answers in there. Is that right, Stuart?
Yeah, lots of answers, great.
Cool, okay, so that's clearly working, which is excellent. So let's tell you a little bit about the schedule for the day. So I'm gonna start by introducing the team, and each of them will explain their backgrounds and approaches. Then we'll go through and introduce the project itself, the rationale, the questions, before moving on to the recruitment and the opportunities that there are to get involved, and then we'll finish off with the next steps. For some reason, I have like a red streak now across my screen. I have no idea why that's there or how that's there, but it's exciting. Okay, so let's start off with the team. I love this photograph. So this was taken the day, in fact, just before we went in for our interview to the Wellcome Trust. That Jenna there is the room where we awaited our fate. And Stuart, you can just about see his face over on the right-hand side of the screen. He was our coach, and he was making us take selfies before we went in. So you can kind of see like the nervousness on most of our faces. I think it shows most beautifully in Gary's face, who looks just terrified. And I think equally we were all terrified, but we covered it up well. So I just wanted to share a fun photo actually. But here's the team slightly more respectably. I say slightly more respectably, it's all still stupid photographs. So I am Naomi Sykes. I'm the one over there on the left holding up a gigantic oryx bone. That's the wild ancestor of all cattle. I'm a zoo archaeologist, so I study animal bones that we recover from archaeological sites, and I use lots of different kinds of techniques, whether it's osteology or connecting up with genetics or isotopes, kind of really to understand how animals lived in the past and how they interacted with humans. So I'm really interested in human-animal environment interactions throughout time around the world, and that's what I sort of bring to the project. I'll pass over to Angela now.
Hi there. So my name's Angela Cassidy. The nearest thing to a discipline that I have is a thing called Science and Technology Studies, which is basically the social aspects of science. I work across this and the history of science, and I'm mostly interested in interactions between science and policy, which is kind of my role in the project, and also public controversies. And as you can see from the picture, my most recent work has been on the very long-standing controversy around badger culling in the UK.
Cool. Gary, do you want to explain who you are and tell us what that photograph is?
Okay, I'm Gary Marvin. I'm a social anthropologist at Roehampton, and my professorship is titled Human Animal Studies. So I am interested in the relationships that humans have with other animals. I know we're all animals. The particular thing that interests me is ethnographic work. We'll come on to this later. So I'm very interested in engaging with different communities of people with their animals. The picture there is not photoshopped. For some reason, a wolf wants to kiss me, and I'm not sure if I want to kiss the wolf.
Excellent. Stuart, your photograph is incredibly substandard. It's just a normal headshot. We need to resolve this. But tell us who you are.
Thanks, Naomi. Yeah, there's no good photos of me, fortunately. So that's why you've got that one. I'm an isotope specialist, so that's my area. I look at particularly isotopes to understand things that we can get from remains, particularly, and my specialisms are isotopes in ecology, and also looking at isotopes in the past in archaeological remains. And so I'm going to be part of the project to look at how we can use these toolkits to help answer these really great questions that we've got around animals, around feeding animals, potential things like domestication, that sort of thing. So some really, really cool projects, I think.
Great. And Andrew, the internet is full of crazy pictures of you, and I found this lovely one of you with some sort of stuffed cat.
Yeah, it's a wildcat, a Scottish wildcat. I'm showing Paul Wheelhouse, the Minister of the Environment at the time, as you do, a Scottish wildcat, because it's very hard to see them in the wild. Yeah, I'm Principal Curator of Vertebrates at the National Museum of Scotland, and I've been involved in lots of different morphometrics, genetics, and stable isotope studies over the years. I'm very good at making collections, especially big collections of things, and connecting with researchers to come up with some fabulous projects. So that's what we're going to do here as well.
Yay, okay. So whilst I've introduced the sort of main team, the co-Is and PIs on this project, we are really fortunate to be supported by a very extensive research network of invested researchers who span disciplines from history, archaeology, veterinary studies, ecology, genetics, museums and collections. So I've just put up a few pictures of some of the folk that we're working with and some of the organizations, and you can see that this is a hugely transdisciplinary project that we're going to be working on that integrates people from like members of the publics all the way through to national and international organizations. So we're really fortunate to have an incredibly strong and exciting team of very, very cool people. So we've also can reveal that we just made some appointments. So I think both Sharon and Ginny are on this webinar, which is great. So Sharon has just started, well, has just been appointed to the project administrator role. So she'll start early in September, and her post will be for 4 years. So she'll be coordinating quite a lot of the research network meetings and just helping us steer the project. So it's really great to have Sharon involved. She's got a huge amount of experience of managing research projects. We've also just appointed Ginny Thomas, who has a background in engaged research. Ginny, do you want to say anything about yourself?
I can say hello really quickly. Hi, everyone.
Okay, and I have to say, I love your photograph. You're like ice cold there and looking very cool. Is that in Amsterdam?
It is. It's not nearly silly enough. I should have let you use the one of the zombie run.
Oh, yeah, well, we shall insert that next time. That's awesome. So it's great to have these guys on the team, but we are actually looking for quite a lot of other appointments as well. So for instance, Angela has 2 PhD students that she's looking to recruit. I'm looking for a postdoc in zoo archaeology. And I think we've got other bony type postdocs that Andrew will be recruiting at the National Museum of Scotland. An isotope ecologist postdoc together with 2 PhD students, and Andrew's got a raft of appointments that he wants to make as well. We'll go into detail about these towards the end of the webinar. So we'll introduce the project first, and then we'll come back to the appointments, because I know quite a few people are here to find out more about these roles, and we're really keen to work with anyone who's interested to kind of like hone their ideas. And so you can pitch us things and we'll help you make them as good as possible, so that even if these particular roles don't come off for you, we can like think about how we might be able to support you doing similar research aligned to our project, and we can throw all of our support behind you. So we see this as a really nice opportunity just to meet new people and find out who's up for jobs and research in general. So that's what we're looking to recruit. Now let's talk a little bit about the project. We've had a long preamble. So what I'm going to do is tell you, well, actually some of this is from the very pitch that we did for Wellcome Trust. And so I've just expanded it a little bit, but this was the opening slide that we had. And the picture on the left, I think is really beautiful. It actually happened on the day that we pressed submit on our application. I went into town in Exeter to like go buy a celebratory big issue, and I bought it from this guy who actually feeds the pigeons, and we had a really nice chat about what the pigeons meant to him, and he, you know, they're his friends. And I thought it was really telling and like a really nice vignette of the whole project, really, because for him, these pigeons are really, really important. But to say Exeter City Council, they don't want either the homeless guy or these feral pigeons around. You know, this is seen as kind of feeding that the council doesn't want to do. It's not very respectable. But yet, on the other hand, we are encouraged to feed birds. You know, we've got this nice, respectable garden bird feeding, which is seen as a very, very good thing. But the truth is that we're now putting like more bird feed into the environment than there are birds to eat it. And that has, you know, potential implications for pollution, for disease transmission. And of course, when we set up bird feed stations, we're actually setting up feed stations for cats as well, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about too. It's like, what are we trying to feed? The issue of cats is interesting as well, because domestic cats are not native to Britain, or in fact a lot of the world. And when they arrived, we still aren't too sure about when domestic cats arrived. That has implications for wild cats, which are native to Britain and across a lot of the areas of the world. But in Britain, I think I'm right in saying, Andrew, aren't I, that the wild cat, which is now the Scottish wild cat, is functionally extinct. It's only there due to breeding programs within zoos. Is that right? Yeah?
Yeah, it is right. Yeah.
Okay, so that's then kind of an interesting tension, that the arrival of the domestic cat that we preferentially feed has potentially led to the extinction, if you like, of the wild cat, which then has its own implications, because they have to be kept within zoos too. And how do you then train an animal that you want to release into the wild to kind of behave as a wild animal? So there are issues of kind of feeding wild animals within zoos that you want to rewild. And that takes us to some of the issues around zoos, because everybody knows the signs that say do not feed the animals, and we're told very clearly that we should not feed animals in zoos. And yet on the other hand, zoos feed us a lot, or they sell us food so that we can do precisely that. So kind of whichever way you look at animal feeding and bird feeding, it's just full of contradictions, and we don't really know what we're doing or why we're doing it, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And so that's what this project is about, trying to get some baseline evidence that tells us if feeding pigeons is really, really bad or good, or, you know, what are we doing essentially? Because we really seem to enjoy feeding animals, and it's something, you don't have all of these signs saying don't do it if people aren't already doing it. So that's what this project is really setting out to explore. So our overarching research questions are, what are the histories and the consequences of animal feeding for health and well-being, whether it's human health, animal health, or environmental health? What we want to know is then also what has driven and is continuing to drive these animal feeding practices. Why is it that we just enjoy feeding animals so much? Is it just like a hobby? Does it make us feel good? Or are there other reasons for us doing it? And then if we can understand both of those questions, can we kind of pull together a transdisciplinary team and use any information that we get from questions 1 and 2, to kind of enhance futures of human, animal, and environmental health? So those are really the overarching questions that we are looking at. So this is a huge project. We're essentially talking about global human, animal, and environmental health, which for a 4-year project, you know, it's not going to be necessarily very achievable. So what we've done is we've decided that we're going to focus down on 4 main research foci. We're going to look at pets, we're going to look at pests, we're going to look at wildlife and zoo life. And what we feel is that by taking those 4 foci, it kind of gives us the constraint that allows us to be a bit more creative in the other things that we look at. So through those 4 foci, we can examine human health and environmental health. We can do health comparisons between, say, big cats that are in zoos versus big cats that are in natural history collections that were wild. So we can do these sorts of comparisons. We can also look at feed industries. And the whole thing, we feel, will give us the ability to explore in a more general sense processes of domestication. So for instance, we can have some animals, such as pigeons, that can occupy all of these different foci. So you can have fancy pigeons, which are in some ways pets, but you can have feral pigeons, you can have wild parrot pigeons, and you can have some that are kept in zoos. So what this allows us to do is look at the whole processes of domestication. But actually what we also think is quite important, and is something that's kind of under-researched, is also that process of fertilization, which tends to come at kind of like the back end of your domestication process. So these are the things that we really want to be drilling down into. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to take you through 3 of the main case studies that we're going to be working on. One is bird feeding, one is cat feeding, and then the other one is feeding within zoos. So starting with bird feeding, you know, it's got a really, really deep history. If you look at a lot of ancient texts, you'll see that people were feeding birds. Over on the left here, we've got a chicken that is being fed as a sort of way of divining the future. But we also know that it's not necessarily just feeding birds grain or things like that. Sometimes birds can actually eat humans as part of funerary rituals. So here's an illustration of some Tibetan sky burials where eagles come in to eat the bodies. In other cases, we can see, so the next image in the middle is philanthropic bird feeding in Delhi, where there's a huge population of black kites that they owe their existence largely to ritual feeding that takes place, because the birds are fed to bring good luck to the people who are feeding. It's part of the spiritual obligation. So there's a lot of different varieties of bird feeding, and we can see into the medieval period there might be falcons that were domesticated and fed. And then there are all of these different kinds of bird feeding that we see. Feeding of birds is a very kind of rosy way of looking at it, with as a sort of rustic aesthetic there, by comparison to then, you know, the pest birds that we see feeding. And as I was saying in the introduction, there are all of these different kinds, but feeding pigeons has been seen as kind of a nuisance issue, and instead we're encouraged to feed the respectable birds. But of course, as I was saying, this comes with a lot of tension. So for instance, I live in Exeter and I jog down by the quay, and there are loads of people feeding swans and ducks bread. And of course, a few years ago, there was a massive campaign saying we really shouldn't be feeding these birds bread because it's really bad for them, it's bad for the environment. And so everybody stopped feeding ducks and swans bread. It was a very successful campaign called Bin the Bread. But the end result was that all of the swans started dying because they had become so used and reliant upon the charity of people that they then all died. And they then had to backtrack on this Feed the Birds campaign, or do not feed them bread, and say, please, please feed them bread. So it's, again, real tensions, and we don't know whether we're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And that's one of the things that we want to explore. And we want to explore that in deep time. So we're going to be working with organisations like Historic England, and Cotswold Archaeology, British Trust for Ornithology, and the National Trust, to kind of do a real deep dive into bird feeding from the earliest examples that we can find right up to the present day. And we've decided that probably one of the most useful species to look at is, in fact, well, I say species, pigeons, taxa, to look at. So from an archaeological perspective, what we're going to do, because pigeons are one of the, I think actually the first domesticated bird. We still don't know when domestic pigeons arrive in Britain. We're going to study pigeons in Britain from their earliest arrival, and we're going to work particularly with Historic England and Polydora Baker to examine, who's the chief zooarchaeologist at Historic England, to explore the whole history of pigeons in Britain and beyond, from identifying their domestication and looking at their the shape of their bones, the size of their bones, the age profiles that we have, to see whether we can detect subtle changes that might come with the feeding of these animals. We're going to link that then with the work that Stuart's going to be doing. So Stuart, do you want to talk a little bit about the isotope element?
Yeah, thanks, Neri. We're going to do a lot of isotope analyses of various different materials, but as a good example here, the pigeon samples, we can get a lot of data from these via carbon, nitrogen isotopes. It's a classic example, looking at extracted collagen from preserved bone material, and we can get sort of dietary information from that will give us an idea of how these pigeons have been feeding and what sort of materials they've been sort of eating. How has that changed over time? Things like that. That's what we're going to be looking at. We also want to explore new areas as well. For example, carbon and nitrogen is a very traditional isotope methods, but we want to include other things. We have lots of new technology, lots of new kit that we have available for working on this project. So we're going to be looking at things like carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, but we're also got compound-specific isotopes, so we can actually extract compounds and analyze the isotopic composition of those. So we can actually dig into the actual material and find out exactly what's going on with these remains in a way that we up to now we haven't really explored.
I think it's going to be really exciting. So essentially we can find out what these pigeons have been eating and tie it to any morphological changes that we might see in the bones. So that's kind of like the archaeological side of it, which can bring it up to modern collections. You know, we could look, say, at, if we were given permission to sample them, we haven't asked yet, so this is saying this off the top of my head, you know, we could potentially take samples of Darwin's pigeons, where, you know, he did lots of his big studies on domestication. We could actually take some of the samples from those birds because he actually fed them as a performance as well. So that's the sort of thing that we could look at. And when we get to these sort of more modern collections, that will allow us to tie in with some of the historical research and policy work that Angela will be doing. So I'll throw to Angela now.
Hiya, thanks, Naomi. So yes, so one of the key angles that the history and policy, broadly speaking, as I describe it, part of the project will be looking at is looking at animal feed industries, and particularly, while there's quite a bit of literature, sort of historical and contemporary, about animal food and pet food, it's really dominated by dogs, and a lot of it is also about the US. So tracing out the connections between animal feed as a commercial activity, where that feed comes from, its connections to human food industries and commercialization and upscaling and industrialization of human food, and then leading into the marketing and selling of feeding animals, and not just feeding pets, but also feeding wild birds, as we're seeing here. So that's one strand that we'll be connecting and looking at how those industries have developed, and how animal nutrition science has developed alongside those industries.
Cool. Okay. Yep, and then Gary, do you want to talk about the anthropological side of this as well?
Yeah, what we're going to be doing, and I take a lead from the RSPB slogan, which is giving nature a home. So where is the home? We will look at pigeons as part of the project. We will also extend it in the anthropology studies to really to perhaps locate it in garden bird feeding. Angela's mentioned the importance of the feed industry. Last figures are somewhere around £200 million was spent by the British per year on garden bird feeding. So what we'd be interested in as anthropologists is this as a cultural social practice. We've got a lot of good qualitative material on how many people feed birds, what they feed them, etc. But we're very low on qualitative cultural things. So the ethnographic study will be to look at things like, what is this as a social cultural practice? Why do people do it? What do they get out of it? What experiences are they seeking? What sort of relationships do they build? How does this relate to other forms of bird watching? What are the aesthetics? And going back to what Naomi said, is you know, good birds, bad birds. We don't want pigeons coming to our feeders, do we? And we'll be very interested in this commensality, sharing food. You know, what is going on here? Is it an act of charity? Is it an act of hospitality? It's a welcoming of particular birds into our cultural spaces.
Thanks, Gary. So I think actually what you were just saying really reminded me of, you know, how much there's been on social media during the lockdown. You know, a lot of people are finding a huge amount of solace actually in feeding their birds, and it's kind of allowed them to escape their own homes sort of mentally. And, you know, in terms of human well-being, it's been incredibly important. And I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to get this project started as soon as possible, so that we could try and perhaps tap into some of that. And I think for similar reasons, it's quite interesting to think about cats as well, because actually, I think, did quite a lot of people send me news clippings about how cats have been just the first animal to have been really diagnosed with COVID. And Angela, did you send me that?
Hiya. Quite possibly, various other people have. It's something I'll pick up on later on.
Oh, okay, great.
About the impact of COVID.
Sure. So, I mean, cats are a really interesting topic, of course, because as I was saying earlier, then the domestic cat is not native to most of Northern Europe, and it's been, in fact, all of Northern Europe, but it has now come to move into our houses and, you know, form very close relationships with people. And you know, you just need to look again at the pet food industry to realize how much sort of economic growth there is around pet food. And I think we tend to feed cats, but we kind of often feed them foods that we think as humans would be good food. So, you know, the rise of cat food that had vegetables in it so that they could get their 5 a day and all of these sorts of things. And I think that's quite an interesting thing for us to explore. But one of the areas that we're really curious to think about is this issue of feeding cats fish. If you look, this is just a screenshot from the internet. If you just write cat food or feeding cats, and you get all of these pictures of cats eating fish. But it's really struck me for a long time. I have no idea why this association between marine fish and cats has come about, because it's not part of their natural diet. And is it just another one of those cases where people are feeding cats fish because we eat fish? I mean, that might be the case, right? Because cats aren't rowing out to sea and like winding down a little line to pull up a cod or anything like that. But what's then even more interesting is then if we think about feeding ourselves fish, you know, we'll generally make sure that we are buying something that is incredibly sustainable. We, you know, be very ethical about the kinds of fish that we are buying to eat ourselves. But when it comes to cat food, like, no one cares. You'll just buy your perfectly fishy cat food. But most of this fish that's in cat food is not like offcuts from human food. And that was something that I found really, really shocking, is that most of the cat food, the fish that are in it are the ones that are not sustainably caught. And in fact, it's the pet food industry that's quite responsible for the decline in pelagic fish stock. And I think there's a real cognitive dissonance when it comes to feeding cats fish. We just think that they should be allowed it, and once it's in a nice stay fresh tin, then it's all fine and we don't have to worry about where it comes from. But actually, I think it is something that we need to think about, and that is something that we can do, again, by looking at the archaeological evidence. So we're going to be working with, again, archaeological sites such as Fishbourne Roman Palace, and I think Rob Simmons, the curator, might be online. So we've got from that site the earliest at the moment domestic cats in Britain, and it'll be really interesting to look to see at their diet and compare through time, when do we start to see fish being introduced to the diet, and what sort of impact might that have on cat health? Because as much as we think that fish is really good for us and we associate eating fish with cats, it's possible that fish is not a really great thing for cats to eat. So there's a particular kind of oral pathology. It's a odontic lesion, resorptive lesion. You can't see it just by looking in a cat's mouth. It's kind of a massive lesion that happens underneath the crown. So when you look in the cat's mouth, it looks like it's perfectly fine. And at the moment, we don't know what causes these lesions. It's suggested that it might be linked into diet. It's suggested that it might be to do with vitamin D, and a lot of the possible causes of this disease seem to be things that cats might potentially get if they were eating a lot of fish. So what we can do is explore in deep time cat diet linked into pathology and see if we can find any kind of correlation. It won't necessarily be a cause, but we can see what correlations are out there. So in terms of the zooarchaeology, we can do studies of pathology and size and shape of cats, and then send those same samples to Stuart for isotopic analysis. So Stuart, do you want to explain the work that you've already been doing on cats?
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. So that little diagram that you can see on the slide there, you probably can't read most of it, but that's a study that we did a pilot study of carbon nitrogen isotopes on modern cats using cat fur. We did lots of big study of the types of food that were being fed, alongside sort of questionnaires to try and work out basically what is that isotopic data telling us? Can we actually get back at some really interesting information? And it turns out that there's actually a wealth of information in the isotope data. So for example, we can tell a fishy cat from a meaty cat. We can actually tell an IAMS cat from a whiskers cat, but you know that potentially in the past might not be such a good thing. But there's also some interesting stuff, like we could also just pull out sort of cats that were hunting versus cats that were just being fed food. So what this shows is there's a real potential to dig into that data in the archaeological collections and really find out some interesting information about the cats and what they were feeding on and how they came about that.
Cool. And then again, that feeds into, we can bring those studies right up to the present so that Angela can explore the history and policy around that too.
Thanks, Naomi. So yeah, these issues around commensalism and cat feeding, that sometimes we're feeding cats that aren't necessarily owned is really important for governance, because of course if animals aren't owned, then nobody's responsible for them, and then that knocks through into both local and national policy. But also this image is a really good example of the kinds of things we might find once we start digging into archives. So this is an image from the Museum of English Rural Life, the Merle collections at Reading, and it's a picture of a salmon fisherman in Dorset, probably during the 1950s to 60s. And so apparently this fisherman, I can't tell if he's professional or if this is a hobby person or what, but he's catching salmon on the river, and there's this family of 15 cats that are relying on his daily catch. So that kind of puts another angle on this question of cats eating fish, is that if it's not tuna, it might be fish that they're encountering via human activities. Further to that, as I say, if nobody owns feral animals, nobody's responsible for them, but at the same time, questions of how we deal with feral animals when they're not wanted really knocks it into questions of policy and governance, and that's something I'll pick up on later.
And Gary, have you got anything that you wanted to add about the anthropology?
Yeah, this will be, excuse me, this will be something I'll talk more about when we talk about the post, but this will be a postdoctoral study. Here we're going to open it out much more. We will look at deep time. We will look at cultures of cat ownership. And I'll just go through some of the things. And one of the things that intrigues me is, for example, the Kennel Club of the UK recognises 218 breeds of dogs, whereas the International Cat Association only recognises 71 breeds of cats. So what is there about the malleability of the cat, and what sorts of relationships are being sought with it? We'll be interested in the fact that it seems that the nature of relationships with domestic cats is more private than with dogs, although you can take a cat for a walk if you train it. It's not so easy. So we've got this status of cats and crossing into the public realm, and they have different legal status. We can then tie it back to the fact that it lived on the margins of houses before it was incorporated into houses. We will also look at the issue that we talked about feeding garden birds, and Naomi meant it before. You know, domestic cats will hunt in the garden, which then brings them into conflict with cat owners. So we're going to look at the whole issue of pedigree, hybridity, relationships, living together, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on.
Brilliant, thanks guys. Okay, so then on to the last sort of main case study, and for this I'm going to throw over to Andrew because he's the zoo guy.
Hi, thanks Naomi. Well, there's a very long history of keeping exotic animals in captivity in Britain, and often this was for their entertainment and prestige value, and sadly often at the expense of their health. So we've got the example here of Henry III's poor old African elephant who was fed red wine and roast beef, which of course is an entirely inappropriate diet for the world's largest vegetarian, and not surprisingly it only lasted a couple of years. But even up to 50 or 60 years ago, chimpanzee tea parties were all the rage in British zoos, and baby chimps were taken from their mothers, whether in the wild or in captivity. They were hand reared and they were fed human food, and this had considerable impact on their physical and mental health later in life. But we know a lot better these days, don't we? After all, many zoos have nutritionists who guide the zoo about what kind of diet their animals should be fed. For example, giant pandas are perfectly adapted to feeding on bamboo, except, next slide, they eat meat when they can get it. But zoos generally don't feed their giant pandas meat, but often they get it accidentally, like this giant panda who's savaging this peacock. So zoos are often not very good at accessing published studies on wild diets, and as a result, captive diets may be inappropriate, and this could impact negatively on the health and the breeding success of zoo animals. So what we want to do is bring about a transformation in knowledge sharing by bringing together different perspectives to improve zoo animal health and well-being. Now, there are a few in-depth studies of particular celebrity animals, such as Chi-Chi the giant panda at London Zoo, but most zoo histories and anthropologies are focused on the human experience. But there are hundreds of skulls and skeletons stored in museum research collections, and at National Museums of Scotland, we've been particularly assiduous about this in the last 30 years, so we have a very large collection indeed. But often, certainly in the historical specimens, their life history records are not associated with those specimens, and they're languishing in zoo archives, and there's been no real attempt to link them together. So what we want to do is bring those strands of physical and archival evidence together and give a voice to the animals that are currently the silent subjects of zoo histories. You're running ahead of me.
Sorry.
So we're going to have a look at archive material, and we're going to link that to the osteology in museums. What's the next thing? Oh yes, and this is Gary's bit.
Gary. Yeah.
Oh, me. Yeah. Once again, excuse me. We're back with an ethnographic study. Particularly, we secured permission from Edinburgh Zoo to have an anthropologist spending time there, looking at regimes of feeding. What interests us, again, going back to Andrew's point, when zoos were set up, they had to acclimatize their animals. They didn't know about feeding. They had to change all sorts of diets. What particularly interests me is the changing diet of the animals in zoos reflecting public sensibilities, whereas people seem to be willing to watch a lion devouring a carcass in the David Attenborough program, seeing a dead cow in a lion's enclosure tends to cause problems. So are we having to feed, or are zoos having to feed animals things that are not particularly good for them or not ideal, simply because the public coming to watch, to see the animals, have particular sensitivities? The other thing that's going to be important is we saw one of those signs saying, do not feed the animals. Why on earth do zoos need signs saying, do not feed the animals? Because clearly people want to feed them. So what is it that zoos do? And I think here on the bottom right, we got an example of a penguin experience where you've got keepers, but people can come in and do it. So there's some way of controlling it. So what is it about the regime of diets and cultural sensibilities? That's going to be the ethnographic study in Edinburgh Zoo.
Angela?
Hiya. Yes, so on the policy and governance side, of course, one of the places where the animal feed industry and issues around feeding animals that are owned but not domestic is, of course, in the zoo. So in terms of looking at this, the zoo is the ideal place to be studying these things. And particularly in terms of zoo history, the literature at the moment isn't so strong. There's a lot of contemporary research on zoos and social aspects of zoos and behind the scenes. There's historical research on zoos, but not so much on the zoo, particularly through the 20th century, and how zoos have their changing understanding of how to feed animals and when to feed animals and when not to feed animals. So we're going to be using the zoo as a site to kind of trace those changes. And particularly, what's particularly cool about this aspect of the project is, of course, Wellcome have recently funded an archives project at University of Edinburgh, which is opening up Edinburgh Zoo's archives. So obviously that's something people we're going to be working very closely with, and we're really looking forward to getting the chance to look at that material. And then, of course, also on museology, the other aspect of this, of course, is our partnerships with not just zoos, but the various museums that we're working with, and thinking about making all of this work and developing research more public facing as well. So engaging with wider publics and audiences and their obvious interest in this topic.
I think I wanted to add something in there, Angela, about the fact that it would be interesting to look at why some animals end up being preserved in museums and others don't. So if we look at the history of keeping, say, of big cats at Edinburgh Zoo, why did some end up in the museum in Edinburgh but not others? And so it'd be really interesting to explore that history.
Yes, it would. I'm nodding vigorously. You can't see me, but it would. So, certainly there is also a question there about what happens to zoo animals after they die, and whether and when they end up in collections, and connecting that up also with the archival record.
That's right, because I can remember when we were first putting this project together, it's the case, isn't it, Andrew, that other than the animals that you go and gather from around Europe, very often when a zoo animal dies, it just has an autopsy and then is incinerated.
Yeah, sadly that is the case. We try and preserve as many as we can, but of course we're still only really the tip of the iceberg.
And of course, the autopsy is just trying to work out how the animal died, whereas we're really interested in exploring the lived experience of the animal. And that's where we can do things like osteobiographies, explore the skeleton, link it with the archives, the written archives about the animals in life, and try to, tell the story of the animals from the animal's perspective. As you were saying, Andrew, that they are really this kind of silent partners here. So I think that that's going to be such a fascinating study. And all of these studies together kind of feed into exploring some broader hypotheses, because if you look at the signs that you'll often see, if you're at the seaside this summer, if you're lucky enough to get out, you might see signs like this that highlight why you shouldn't feed the birds. So there's some sort of explanation, and it talks about, okay, so you don't want to feed them because then they might stop migrating and then their populations might increase. And actually, when you start to unpick some of the reasons why we shouldn't be doing these things, is very close to a lot of the things that people say about domestication. That, domestication represents a shift in behavior and a shift in demographics and population. And actually, our overarching hypothesis for this whole project is that actually one of the things that we're exploring is whether domestication, we might need to start rethinking domestication and the ways that we approach the whole field. So what I've got here is a couple of images lifted from the internet, where you can see on the left, people have pulled together data saying, okay, so when did domestication happen? What different kinds of domestication have happened? And what you should be able to see is that commensal domestication, which is the kind of thing that we're exploring, this commensalism of humans kind of providing food. Commensalism is believed to be one of the first forms of domestication. So things like dogs, there's a possibility that they became domesticated through the commensal pathway. But what you can see on this graph is that the suggestion is that all of this kind of domestication through commensalism kind of stopped about 2,000 years before present. But if we think about everything that we've just been talking about, our hypothesis is that this kind of domestication has not stopped at all. It's not only continuing, but I think it's probably accelerating. And that becomes then a little bit scary when you read the work of Zoyner, who was saying, like, in the 60s that, you know, the last stage of domestication is extinction. And that does seem to be the case, right? The more that we mess around with animals, the more vulnerable they become, or the more impact they have on the environment. So I don't think it's a complete coincidence that when you look at these two graphs, they're showing a very similar kind of uptick in extinctions as we're starting to see this acceleration of, you know, feeding cats, feeding birds, let's just domesticate everything. And we've just taken a few different case studies, but, you know, there's a lot of feeding of wild foxes, feeding of wild deer, and it's really changing all of their behavior. I think that domestication hasn't stopped at all. And so that's one of the things that we really want to explore and get new data about, so that we can start making some differences to history and policy. So I'll throw back over to Angela for that.
Thanks, Naomi. So in terms of kind of studying this, as I've already kind of flagged, one of the real challenges here is that we're trying to look at kind of policy around something that is incredibly fragmented. And so, you know, we're looking at issues that impact NGOs, for example. So all this debate around whether birds should be fed bread or not is often something that for example, RSPB are very concerned about, environmental NGOs and so on and so forth. The whole question of feral animals, so we've got some more feral cats here, and who is responsible for them, how they should be managed, what happens if they start causing problems for humans or other animals or for agriculture, the question of policy at a local level. So we've got a little graphic here which is about the various responsibilities of local councils, local authorities. So managing pests and managing rubbish are of course very, very key there. But at national level, of course, governance is incredibly fragmented, and no more so than around animal feeding. So on the one hand, we have governance and regulation around human feed and human food, and that knocks onto animal feed industries. But other places where central government is really not involved at all. So we've got this incredibly fragmented picture. So that's kind of a major challenge, is just mapping out what this is. And so the framework of governance is really, really important. So thinking about policy, not just in terms of what conventional government do, but actually the interaction between central government, local government, the third sector, industry and wider publics. And so that collective sense of governance is a much more useful framework for thinking about this. Of course, the other context to that is that thinking historically, we're moving from a situation post-war where a lot of policy and also science around agriculture and the environment was very state-led, state-run and state-managed. And over the following the rest of the 20th century, moving into the 21st century, we've seen a situation where that has become privatized and institutionally fragmented over time as well. And so an example of that, which is leading out of my badger research, but I'm looking forward to digging into more, is the case of pest control within MAF. So post-war and up until...
What's MAF? Is that Ministry of Agriculture?
Ministry of Agriculture, that's the UK Ministry of Agriculture.
Oh, okay.
I'm so used to just saying MAF. So anyway, they have their own government labs and government pest control officers, and it's managed and also investigated research-wise centrally from post-war up until the 1980s, and then becomes increasingly fragmented. And there are still government science which is now oriented towards what's called wildlife management, but the situation is much, much more fragmented. And so investigating that story is one example of how we can think about this changing over time. Finally, of course, the other aspect of this is, sorry, Naomi, you skipped ahead.
Sorry.
Is engaged research and working with our stakeholders, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Okay, now we can shift on.
Okay.
And of course, what's very present, and it's already come up in the comments a few times, is that this entire project, as pretty literally as it started, we've watched the ground shifting all around us in terms of how COVID is reshaping all of these issues around animal feeding. So firstly and most obviously, we have the issue of cats and COVID, and that we're now seeing lions in zoos have been catching the virus, and domestic cats. I think just this week we had the first official cat case in the UK, which of course also raises the spectre of whether the zoonotic nature of COVID is when it's coming from animals and when it's going from us to animals and back again, and what animals. So that's a whole aspect there that may change some of those dynamics around feral animals, and particularly feral cats. The issues around what we've seen as lockdown kicked in, and the animals suddenly became very much more visible in all sorts of ways. So not rubber ducks per se, but this idea of that suddenly animals became more visible because people weren't around, and what that means, not just for the animals, but also for our ideas about nature and animals. Thirdly, we've touched on this already, this issue of under lockdown, that bird watching has become incredibly popular, has been a massive solace for many, many people. And the other aspect, of course, of the withdrawal of humans from urban spaces in particular, is that feral and commensal animals that were existing and largely being fed by human waste, suddenly some of those food sources have been withdrawn. And so we're also seeing lots of stories about animals having to change their behavior, and humans perceiving this as quite threatening. So, for example, monkeys in, I think it's Thailand, we're seeing lots of stories about scary rats, things like that. Then we have the knock-on in terms of zoos. So zoos and wildlife parks obviously had to close under lockdown. They've only just reopened. Some of these institutions have used online technologies and TV and media to kind of stay connected with their audiences and visitors even when they haven't been able to be open. And then, of course, more practically speaking, COVID has had a massive, massive impact, not just on zoos, but also museums and our various project partners, NGOs and the third sector in general we're painfully aware that they're now in all sorts of difficulties. And so thinking about how that affects our project and their priorities is really critical. Finally, of course, most obviously, the fact that we're doing this launch on the internet. So the meme here, I'm probably showing my age in terms of the Muppet Show, but what it means to mostly be interacting and working with and collaborating and socializing with people via a screen. Okay, so that's just a few of some of the implications of COVID for our whole project. So shifting on now. So I mentioned the idea of engaged research. So what we mean by engaged research is that we have, as mentioned right at the beginning, we have this absolutely awesome research network of many, many partners. And so in terms of our project, it's really, really important that the questions we're asking are not just questions that we're interested in as academics, but are also useful and interesting questions for our stakeholders and partners. And so in the way that the project is organised is that we will be having research network events and workshops and meetings intermittently throughout the project. And these are not there as opportunities just for us to disseminate what we have found. These are opportunities to draw together the multiple threads of the project, the different disciplines, as the research is developing, and critically opportunities for our partners to help guide and develop the research. Also, all of these events will involve public engagement in some form or other. Okay, next slide. So to give you some more concrete ideas, and there's some looming questions here as well. So early on, in particular, the focus will be on bringing everyone, all of our partners, everyone from our research network together, so that we can say, okay, we have this awesome project. What specifically are we going to be investigating, and how are we going to shape those research questions and sharpen them up? So we'll be bringing absolutely everyone together right at the beginning to kind of help set the agenda for the project. And this is an example of an earlier event that was run in one of Naomi's projects. Is this a chicken one, Naomi?
No, this is antimicrobial resistance thing in India.
Ah, right,
Really
okay. So early on, our events will be very much about this. Then as the project kind of really gets rolling and the various strands of the research get going, we will shift into more of a kind of a workshop mode where the workshop will be themed on a very specific topic. So zoos, or looking at creating zoobiographies, so on and so forth. Some of these will be led by our early career researchers, and we think that's a really important part of it. And in those, we will bring in project partners as appropriate to the topic. Also, ideally, and this was part of the original plan, is that we would hold many of these events at our project partner sites, which of course leads us on to kind of the looming issue here, is that you can see lots of lovely pictures of people in a room together doing cool stuff. And so we're obviously thinking really, really hard about how to kind of adapt our research design to deal with the situation we're living with now. So part of our original project is that we had planned that all of these events would have an online component. So we had already decided to adopt what's called a nearly carbon neutral model of conferencing, which involves presentations and also comments on presentations being hosted online. So obviously we'll be expanding that quite a bit. We're also thinking really hard and frankly thieving lots of examples of fantastic practice around how to kind of take this work online under lockdown that we've seen over the last 6 months or so, of kind of, for example, how you actually socialize and how you build those kind of connections of hanging out and getting to know people, how you do that online. Another example, when we're thinking about the more research focused events, that we might actually be able to take those to wider audiences by adopting some of those models that are sometimes used on TV, for example, of where you have kind of a live research event that is more open to wider publics. So we've got lots of ideas, and we're developing those to say directly to those of you who are our project partners. We're aware that your needs are shifting, and so please get in touch and let us know, what are your needs, what's your capacity right now, how best can we help you do the work that you need to do as part of this project and as part of this engaged research mode. So please get in touch, because we're currently reworking and thinking quite hard about how we're going to do this. Okay.
Great, I was just unmuting myself. I've got lots of estates trucks driving past my window. Okay, so then the outcomes of this project then, you know, I'm going to skip over quite a lot of this, but in terms of the publications, we've got a sketched out idea of, you know, what we want to see come out of this project. But actually, as Angela was just saying, there are so many moving parts and so many different collaborators on this project. Again, we want to wait and talk with people, with our early career researchers, to see what's going to be the right thing for everyone. So some people might want to have a monograph, other people might want to write lots of articles. We want to do a lot of stuff together. So I think in terms of publications, you can expect that there will be a lot coming out of this project, but the actual form that that's going to take, I think, will emerge once more members of the team are appointed. We actually see that the people who work with us on this project, the people that we appoint to the positions, are going to be a really significant outcome of the project itself, because they're going to be trained in so many different skills and have the potential to take their research in all sorts of different ways. And I've just put up a picture of some colleagues on another project that I was running, just as an example of actually our people go on to really good things. So under the careers bubble there, I've got a few of my colleagues, all of them have gone on to really cool jobs, but not just in academia. So Alison on the left is a freelance zoo archaeologist. Mel, I think, is working for the Department of Health. Heidi at the British Museum, that's me. And then over to Ophelia, I think she might actually be on the call. She's just landed a huge independent research project to go off and study chickens around the world. It's going to be super cool. And Holly has a lectureship. So, you know, our people have really diverse careers, and we as the co-Is on this project are really committed to supporting the careers of all of our people, but also trying to see how we can work and provide best for our partners as well. I should say that we've pitched you this project, but we see this very much as the starting point. Having won this grant, it already entitles us to apply for more funding, and we're planning to put in an application to the research enrichment funding, which will allow us to bring more funding in for our partners to do, you know, good public liaison and communication. But we also, this project at the moment is fairly focused on Britain. That's not something that we see happening forever. We see this as a first starting point to kind of try out our methods before we can start thinking about this kind of global human, animal, environmental health. So those are the sorts of outcomes that we're thinking of. You know, there's going to be new ways of thinking about collections, but this big set of outcomes is what we aspire to, and we're hoping that everyone here is going to kind of help us achieve those goals. So that's our project. And thank you for listening. I'm conscious that we're now just over an hour since we started. So what I'm going to suggest is that we take a break, and Stuart has a review of the questions, and it will give you a bit of time to type in a few more questions if you're interested. And then in perhaps 10 minutes, let's say at 12:20, we come back and we'll field some questions about the project itself, and then we'll move into the appointments. So if that means that the research network, if you're kind of busy and don't want to hang out any longer, you can sneak off, but be aware that, you know, do follow us on Twitter, because then we'll be able to give you updates about the next steps, and I'll come back to that towards the end. But if you've got to rush off, I know we've got a lot of very busy collaborators, now would be a reasonable time to do so. If you're really interested in the appointments, come back afterwards and we'll go through those in detail, and you can pitch us some questions about that too. So we'll stop now. Rejoin at 12:20. Feel free to not leave. We'll probably turn off our mics, and then we'll all be back in the room at 12:20, and we can answer your questions. I hope that sounds okay. Huge thanks for sticking with us through this first part of the webinar.
There we go.
What meeting? What?
Yeah. Okay, so there have been quite a few questions coming in, and I think, Stuart, you've been reviewing them all, haven't you?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so there's quite a few. There's lots of interest, which is great, and lots of people have said that they're really interested and want to be in contact with us, and that's absolutely great. We'll do that. There's a couple of specific questions which, if you want me to just read those out to you, is that okay?
Great.
Yes. So,
sorry, Stuart. I was just going to suggest, should we handle the questions that were about the project now, and hang on to the ones that are about the positions until after we've talked about the positions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We can push all of those into the next section, I think.
So anyone who's asked questions about those, don't worry, you will be answered, but give us a bit of time. Sorry, Stuart, carry on.
No, that's absolutely right. Now that's what I was going to do anyway. Just sort of, so we'll go through the sort of questions about the project. So the first one really is from Ida Paul. She wants to know if there's ideas of comparing the isotopes from cat diets and human diets on the same time scale to investigate any links, and what that, for example, what the humans are eating versus what the cats are being fed, which I think is a really good question. Do you want me to answer that one?
Well, I mean, I will reply by saying, yes, absolutely. That's what we've been doing with dogs already. We've been doing a really fun study of human dog diet, and we're just trying to bring that to publication at the moment. But I mean, Stuart, you're the isotope guy, so it's just about, I guess, whether we've got, consumables enough to do that. But I would have thought we can.
Yes, is the answer. Yeah.
Yay!
If I could just add, Naomi, I mean, one of the things that will be interesting is, cats being fed scraps from the human table through to what Angela was talking about, the industrial creation of specific foods, which can now be bought, I find really interesting, in supermarkets.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in what we didn't say is that in prep for this grant, we Stuart and I and a few others actually did a bit of a pilot study looking at cat diet. And anybody who's seen me talking at conferences, I often throw up the slide because I find it so exciting. But we have started to get quite a lot of decent cat baseline data through time from the Iron Age right up to the present day, and started seeing how things change. And I think what we want to do is more of that, but as Isla says, is link that into shifts in human diet as well. And of course, there's a lot of published data that's already out there, and because people tend, correct me if I'm wrong, Stuart, but I get the impression that when people study animals in terms of isotope analysis, it's always kind of like to understand some sort of broad isotope ecology so that you can better understand what humans are doing, rather than it being looking at the relationship between people and animals, if you know what I mean. So the animal data is there either as a proxy for human diet, in the case of dogs, or as background data so that we can understand human diet. And I think what we're going to be doing is looking at these cats more as individuals, and we can pull together data that have already been published, but have just, and think about them in different ways. So there's quite a lot of cat isotope data that's out there already with humans from the same site, but they've just never been thought about in this way. And I think that's what we'll try to do. Is that, would you agree, Stuart?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good answer to that question. Yeah. Juliet's also posed a question on similar lines, and she puts, will there be any scope for looking at the value we humans place on different species and different individuals from within a single species, and what role this has and is playing in the evolution domestication relationships with humans?
So I can jump in quickly with a sort of archaeological kind of take on that. So that's a very timely question. I'm actually in the process right now of pulling together an application, a couple of applications actually, with Gregor Larson and Sarah Cockram and Carly Armin and a few other people, where we're looking at, say, dogs as individuals rather than data points, so that we can really understand the complexity of the relationship between people and dogs, rather than this kind of homogenous dog group. You know, we just want to look at what dog actually means, because it's so varied and so complex and has changed through time. So that's going to be one of the things that we'll be exploring. And it's that kind of methodology that I think we'd be really keen from an archaeological perspective to explore as part of this project too. But I suspect that Gary and Angela will have a sort of take on that from a more recent perspective.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Gary, or shall I?
Yeah, very quickly. And again, it's a really basic point. Domesticated animals have been created and bred for their bodies. I mean, this is all very, very crude in the use of their bodies. What interests me is with pets or companion animals, what we want to call them now. These are animals that have been created for relationships, and that's the most important thing. So going back to what Naomi said, it's not just a dog. You know, the people have individual relationships with these animals, and they're about for creating affection, etc., etc.
Yeah. So I mean, from the kind of policy and historical point of view, so those of you who are familiar with animal history will know that there's a very big ongoing discussion about the traces that animals leave in the archive, which is something I've worked on before. And of course, it does mean that quite often the most visible traces are those of named individual animals. But the other side of that is in terms of kind of scientific and institutional histories. So like the pest control people in UK government, there you have flat categories, but within that you still also have traces and records of specific interactions. So it's both of those things will get balanced in terms of what we're going to find.
Anything more to add on that one? Sounds like we're good. Other questions, Stuart?
Okay, so well, a quick one from Rob has asked. Rob Simmons asked. I guess the project's now in the public domain, so can share the info with other networks. I think that could be an easy one to answer.
Yes, please do so, Rob, and tweet the crap out of it. That would be amazing if you're allowed to. That would be really, really great. I think I saw a question from, is it Gareth Pierce, about whether we're going to explore commensalism as a kind of anthropogenic impact that influences the entire global ecosystem. That, I think that's kind of, yeah, definitely the sort of thing that we're trying to do. Does everyone kind of agree?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, also thinking about commensalism as a way of understanding human-animal relationships, I think is really, really, really super important. And kind of the backdrop to that is the industrialization of the food system and how that's also in turn knocked on to commensalism, as I kind of flagged in terms of some of these issues around urban animals at the moment.
Cool.
There's a couple of questions about Yannick in particular has asked about, do we want to, is there room or interest for materials from other European countries that could serve as comparisons for different feeding regimes, or are we just going to focus entirely on Britain, which was which was in the pitch basically?
Sure. So I think, as with all projects, in order to get funding, you have to make your work look very achievable and feasible. So we kept it quite Britain focused, and it had a real logic to that. But I think now that we've got the funding, yes, we want to expand everywhere and work with other people who might want to, I've already had some communication with people in Australia, and they're like, oh, how about we create sister projects over here? And it's like, yes, absolutely. So we can all share resources to make this a much bigger global project, because this is more than a lifetime's work, I think, to explore all of this. So the more people who are interested in getting involved, and we can help other groups get money, I think that's the sort of thing that we'd like to do. And definitely, if there's information that's useful that you want to bring in, then by all means, I think what we should do is start thinking about how we can expand our research network. We always, the slide that I put up just had a few people. We name checked some people in the application itself, but it was always our expectation that once we got the money to make the research network much, much bigger, and bring in anyone who was interested. So for instance, Anastasia, it would be great to have you on the research network. You're working on similar questions in Russia. And yeah, Yannick, definitely, I think we should probably be bringing you on as well. Anyone who's interested, I think just reach out and send an email, and we can make sure that you're involved in any of the sort of bigger discussions as we go forward. And then we can always just iteratively think about opportunities as we move forward with this project. So it's really great to have you guys involved and interested from the start.
I'll just chip in briefly on that. So, I mean, the reason for the UK focus, as we flagged, is actually partly just sheer practicality because our questions are so broad. But also, I want to flag that in studying the UK, we see it as specific and weird rather than generalisable to the rest of the world. So the more we can learn from kind of parallel cases elsewhere, the better. The other aspect to that in terms of the research network is, of course, the fact that online interaction is going to be so much more important now means that we can open up that aspect of our interaction geographically much more. And so, yeah, I would echo that in terms of the online aspects of the research network, if we can have more international and global interaction, the more we can have, the better. Okay.
Yep. I'm seeing that Ellen has got a question. Are you going to be looking at indirect feeding of animals, i.e. how animals use, oh, that's just changed, how animals use human behavioural cues to locate food? Oh, that sounds like animals that are alive, in which case I'm out. So who wants to answer that question? That sounds like an ecology, Angela, Gary type question.
It's probably more Gary shaped in terms of this specific project.
Or imagine it being some of our research networks, so like Robbie McDonald and those guys, I think are kind of doing that sort of work already. Stuart, are you doing anything like that?
Yeah, a little bit of that. Yeah, just it touches on quite an interesting sort of series of questions about that that sort of locating food through human behaviour. So it's something that we were looking at with the cats in particular, the modern cats, because the what we found was there was a lot of sort of human behaviour within the cat feeding. So, for example, we had a cat that was being fed almost entirely on Sainsbury's pate because their owner was eating lots of Sainsbury's pate. So yeah, so there is something in that which is quite good.
I think that the other angle on the indirect feeding of animals is, of course, this is why I'm slightly obsessed with pest control, is because historically and in terms of governance now, that's one of the places where indirect feeding of animals leaves a trace, is when there's lots of indirect feeding going on, which means you have lots more animals who aren't under anybody's control, who are causing problems in various ways.
Right, I'm looking at the time. We're just over 12:30, so I think we should move on to the appointments, and then aiming to be wrapped up by 1 so that everyone can get off. So I'm going to move the slides forward. Thanks, those were really great questions. And if we didn't answer any of them, we can follow up with you afterwards. So moving on to this next section then. Stuart, do you want to kick off with the jobs that you're looking to appoint?
Sure, yes. So we've got a 3-year postdoc at University of Reading, and we are very much going to be sort of part of the analytical hub, really, I guess, for the project. So we're looking for someone who has got a PhD in a very broad range of backgrounds, really. Archaeological science, could be earth science, could be ecology. But the key thing is that they can't be frightened of mass spectrometers and doing analytical work, that sort of thing. We want someone who's got a real, perhaps good skill set in analysing isotopically either animals, either modern animals, human, modern and or archaeological remains, that sort of thing. So someone's got a real interest in that, and that would be really important. So quite a broad range of backgrounds. There's also 2 PhD studentships that we've also got. One will start certainly around January time, and some details are on the slide there. I've put there as a sort of a normal title of They Are What We Eat, to look at using isotopes as what can we get from those in terms of pulling out messages about either domestication and or feeding behaviours. And similarly, there was another one starting later next year as well. But very much with the postdoc and with the PhD studentships, we're really open for people to pitch their ideas. So if you've got some good ideas, then don't be frightened to come forward with those, because we want you to sort of mold these projects very much as in the same way that we're doing it. So please don't be frightened. If you've got a great idea, then come forward and we can talk about it. But those adverts will be out with us for fairly shortly, I would imagine.
And of course, the other thing that we can add in is, you know, if we can have those discussions around possible PhD projects, whilst there's not going to be a huge amount of funding, I think, in a post-COVID world, there is still some funding out there for, you know, doctoral training things. So even if you didn't get funding for one of these particular studentships, it would be possible for us to apply for something else. So for instance, Stuart and Andrew and I are putting in an application for a collaborative doctoral award that will be around these same topics. So these aren't the only opportunities that will come along, but they're the ones that are there right now. So I think the sooner we all get into discussion about this stuff, the sooner we can start creating new opportunities. So Stuart, shall I click onto the next slide where you can give an example of the kind of things that,
yeah,
you know, an example?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is just an example of the sort of things that we've been doing and the sort of things that we can do. And I think that this slide sort of details this, some of the work we've done on raptors, in particular red kites, where we can look at the dietary information we get from the stable isotope analyses to try and unpick how human feeding behavior has really helped the red kites come back from an endangered situation to a really quite a common common bird throughout Britain now. And that is a direct result of human feeding, and there's no doubt about that. The isotope data really supports that. But I think one of the things is just a really good example of the sort of toolkit that we can throw at the type of problem that we've got. And also it's about that toolkit. It's not about particularly it being obsessive about particularly carbon and nitrogen, but there's lots of different things that we can do. And it's just the approach that we want to do is have a really informative science-led approach to answering these key questions about sort of the animal remains and also the zoo collections, both the museum collections. How can we actually enhance that information that we can get from those? And we've got some really, really great analytical tools at Reading, so we can do some really cool science. So I think it's just an example of what we can do. So please apply if you're really interested in these.
Cool. I'm gonna click over to Andrew. You're up next.
Yeah, so we have a 3-year postdoc post, which is going to be looking at this influence of captivity on the health and adaptation of the animal to captivity, so how it's responding to a completely different environment. And this will be partly through morphometrics, but we also want to look, as I mentioned earlier, at linking the data in zoo archives to animals that are preserved in those collections and exploring a bit more about why those animals have been preserved. As well as that, we've got a 3-year part-time assistant curator for 2 days a week. This will nominally be to free up my time as a curator to work on the project, but could be involved in producing a lot of the background data that's going to be needed for this project, which I would otherwise have to do. That is flexible, so it could be, say, 3 days a week for 2 years. We can discuss that. So I think we've got a lot of fascinating stuff to look at in the collection in Edinburgh, and there's other material in London too. So it could be absolutely amazing.
Cool, great. I think then I'm up next. So we've got at Exeter a 3-year postdoc, and we're looking for somebody who's probably a zoo archaeologist or a closely related discipline, but also has experience perhaps of isotope preparation, but that's not that's pretty easy to learn. And what our team will be focusing on is this question of birds and the domestication of the pigeon, the feeding of the pigeon, and how that has influenced morphology. So we'd be looking at pathologies, morphology, and diet as well. And what I should say is that although each Edinburgh, Reading and Exeter, they'll be leading on different areas, they'll all be working together. All of these kind of zoo arc science postdocs will have to be working really closely together so that they can help each other out. So I think you need to expect that these postdocs are going to be great for people who are really happy to collaborate and collect data for each other. So it's going to be a really fun experience. And there'll probably be quite a lot of moving around as well, because we'd like people to get a bit of familiarity in the different locations. But of course, there's budget to cover all of that, assuming that we're ever allowed to kind of properly travel or go to collections ever again. Because I think, Andrew, do you have a sense of when your collection may be open ever?
It's possibly from September, but it possibly might not even be until next year now. Until January.
Okay, so you can see that we're going to have to be very flexible in our approaches to these jobs, and for that reason we're not always putting down the timescales of when we're appointing, because we don't know when we're going to be able to. We're hoping to have these positions up and running, but there's no point in setting the clock ticking on a 3-year postdoc when you're not able to do anything. So we might even investigate possibilities of starting people at part-time, bringing them up to full-time, or, you know, in discussion with everyone, but thinking about how we can move these jobs forward. But they should be a lot of fun with a great team. So that's the extra one. It's kind of ZooArc working on birds but contributing to all of the others.
Okay, so as mentioned before, we already have our postdoc Ginny on board, and her role will be kind of mapping out this kind of theme of fragmented governance and also coordinating the engaged research network. But there will be 2 PhDs which will be supervised by myself and sitting in my department, which is sociology, philosophy and anthropology at Exeter. But there will be co-supervision with other members of the project team. So again, that theme of kind of working across the project is going to be super important. So the 2 PhDs, one way to kind of help these projects focus a little bit is, so the first one will be focused particularly on the animal feed itself. And so that's why I was suggesting this idea of following the animal feed and where it comes from and where it goes. So thinking about things like nutrition science, how it's regulated, feed industries, so on and so forth. The second one will be focused more specifically, will have more of an institutional focus. So thinking about the gap I mentioned around 20th century zoo history and contemporary history going up to the present day of these issues around feeding time and what animals are fed and how they're fed and so on. But as Stuart mentioned, these are kind of really quite big buckets. And so I'm really, really interested in what proposals you might have and ideas you might have within, sitting within those themes. The other thing to flag is that in terms of research background for this, so I'm flagging science and technology studies, history of science, policy studies, environmental sociology, topics, areas like that. But in terms of kind of undergraduate background, I'm quite flexible because, as many of you know, working in these kinds of areas, we move around disciplines quite a lot. And actually my undergraduate was in zoology. So, so that's broadly what I'm interested in terms of these 2 PhDs. And I'm really, really excited to see what ideas that you have. Okay.
Gary, do you want to speak to your many appointments?
Yes. Also, I'd like to mention there'll be another Stuart involved in this. My colleague Stuart Semple in my department, who's a biological anthropologist, very interested in cross-disciplinary work and particularly interested in one of his areas is animal welfare. So he'll be involved with the PhDs and with the postdoc. So what we've got, sorry, I'll go back a stage. As Naomi said, we're very open to things and we're open to engaging with concerns, issues, questions, etc. of our partners. So we have Roehampton, these will be anthropological. We have set areas which are very broad, as Andrew has just said and Stuart Black has said. If you're interested in applying, we are not being prescriptive about these, apart from little bits I was saying. We are open to ideas, so come and talk to me about what you would like to do. But the postdoc will be working on humans and cats, and I've spoken a little bit about that through deep time. So what we won't hope to bring to this is an ethnographic study, could be historical, ethnographic, of human relationships with cats. And we will be linking with Stuart and Angela and all these people. So this is not anthropology just because we don't do numbers. We're not in a ghetto on our own. We had 2 fully funded PhD studentships. Again, we're open to backgrounds, but what is definite is one will be a study of wild bird feeding, especially garden birds. So that one couldn't suddenly become a cat project. That is what we've got there. The second one is an ethnographic study of feeding regimes, again linking with Angela's. It will be at Edinburgh Zoo because Edinburgh Zoo are open to having an ethnographer there. So what we get with that one is engaging with the nutritionists there, hanging around with the visitors, talking to the keepers, etc., etc. The issue, of course, as we've all brought up, is ethnography is about being there and doing. Sorry, here's the slide. The key thing with ethnographic methods is being there with the people with whom we are studying. And this is going to be a challenge. We will have to rise to the challenge in this period of COVID. And it might not look like this, but it's going to be ethnographic in some form. So please, if you're interested, get in contact with me and we'll give you more information, and these should be advertised pretty soon. I don't know if I said on those slides, well, I think we were hoping to start everyone in January 2021.
Brilliant, thanks Gary. So I think then that's kind of the jobs that are available, and so let's open up then the questions. We can start by revisiting the questions that were asked already around the some of the PhD and postdoc opportunities. Stuart, are you able to run through what some of them are? Oh, here we are. I can find some. Yeah, if you could lead us with those.
So there've been a number of questions about people, if they're EU citizens without residence in the UK, will they be able to apply for those positions, both either PhD and or postdoctoral positions?
So my understanding would be that for a postdoc position, it doesn't matter where you are applying from. That's standard job application. You would put in and you would apply, and if you're the best candidate, it doesn't matter where you're from, we would make it happen. There might be some visa issues, but generally, I don't want to speak for all universities, but many universities will actually pay the visa fees in the first instance. However, I don't know if policy will change now that all universities have no cash. In terms of the PhDs, at the moment, my understanding is that home and EU would still be eligible. Is that your understanding, guys, from your institutions?
Yes, that's right.
Oh, sorry, from Gary, yes, that is what I understood. So we have the 2 PhDs, it's fully funded with a bursary, and it's UK and EU.
So, at the moment, I mean, I've heard nothing to suggest that Brexit is going to change that. Have any of you?
Yeah, I was just going to say I haven't heard either way, and I will basically have to talk to our doctoral college and find out what's happening there.
But certainly we've just been appointing, so at Exeter's Doctoral College, we certainly just appointed a home EU PhD studentship. So my sense, I have not heard anything to suggest that Brexit is going to cause big problems at this point, but it might be that blows up at some point. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to be a problem. Broader international, of course, would be a problem because we haven't been awarded international fees. So if you're from the States or outside the EU, you would not be eligible for the PhDs.
Great, thanks, Naomi. And then there's a few other questions. So Yannick had some questions about are the PhD positions full-time placements? at one of the collaborating unis, and obviously that question about how does Brexit affect and COVID-19 about the use, you know, sort of work placements, how is that going to be? Are we going to be working from home? So I think there's lots of sort of practical questions there that could be.
So as you'll probably have seen from the presentation, that the different PhDs are indeed linked to particular institutions. But as Angela mentioned, all of the PhDs are going to be co-supervised across the project. So for instance, I think Angela will be co-supervising Gary's PhD students, and Gary likewise with Angela. I'll be working with Stuart, but those PhD studentships would be based in the organisations that they're being hired from. In terms of whether they can be part-time, I think that I can see no reason why that wouldn't be a problem, but I think each institution would need to double check just in case there are financial implications, because that would then spread the spend of the award over longer periods. And where we've got quite a lot of matched PhD studentships which have been provided by the institutions, and there might be more financial hurdles for those because they will have allotted them to particular years of spend. So spreading them might be problematic, but I'd have thought for HR reasons, you have to be allowed to do something part-time. So I would need to get back to you, or I would need to, unless anybody knows different. Guys, do you have a sense of whether part-time would be possible?
I think it might be difficult at Roehampton. I don't know. I mean, they've certainly been costed for full-time.
Okay, so I think we would probably need to double check on that, just because I'm sure that HR would, so for human resources, there must be human resources reasons why people should be allowed to do part-time if necessary. Then again, they might compete that against what the project requires. So we need to double check. But there was another question about whether there could be lots of working from home. I think the way that most universities are going, certainly speaking from Exeter's perspective, is that whilst we have a lovely campus, I happen to be on campus right now, the mood music is very much that they don't want to have lots of people on campus. So the expectation is that probably we're going to be spending, like at least 40–50% of our time working from home. So I think we need to get used to this new normal of working remotely and collaborating remotely, with some, you know, great opportunities to come together with social distancing. But yeah, I think things are going to be different as we go forward. And then it's not just about COVID. I think a lot of universities realize that this is a great opportunity to address some of the environmental problems that, you know, international travel and unnecessary meetings have had. So, and also the benefits for people to work from home as well. So they're trying to rejig things so that when we come out of this, it's actually a positive move and addressing lots of different issues. So I'm sure there would be a lot of flexibility for working from home.
Thanks, Naomi. And the other key questions are about the practicalities for the postdoctoral positions. So when are they going to be advertised? And also, you know, people who are sort of in the last throes of submitting their PhDs, could they apply during that, you know, as they're submitting, sort of thing? So some sort of.
Sure. So I think those are really good questions, and to some extent this will also go to will depend on the different institutions. So for instance, we've managed to appoint one person so far, but that was we had to make the case for different kinds of paperwork and things like that so that we could appoint at because I think we've actually costed them in at quite high levels. Is that right, Angela? We've gone for PDR.
Yeah, in general, the costings were for research fellow positions. So, but for example,
yes, so
with the postdoc that we've just appointed, we actually advertised it at PDRF and PDRA. Obviously, it's going to be up to the other partners and how they want to handle that.
So just to give the background on this, we did have all of the costings we put in for researchers who actually have quite a lot of experience. But Angela and I, when we were in discussion with HR, we were like, come on, you know, it might be that there is some fabulous candidate who hasn't even finished their PhD. So for instance, I have another project, and I headhunted a girl who was just finished. She was like in the second year of her PhD, but I knew that I wanted her because she was just so awesome. And we had to make the case that we could appoint someone who hadn't actually finished their PhD. she could only take up the position once she was submitted and was appointed at a particular grade, but we really wanted to make sure that there was potential for us to do that, even though we'd costed in at a higher level. So I think all of us collectively on the team want to make sure that these postdoctoral research positions are as open as possible, because I think you can get incredible people who've just walked out of their PhD, you can get incredible people who have several books and have done several postdocs already, but we want to be able to make sure that we can just get the best people regardless of their career stage. Sorry for jumping in, Angela, I just kind of wanted to get that across.
No, that's fine.
And then also a question about when those posts are going to be advertised.
So collectively, we've been chatting about this as well, haven't we? Because I think at the moment, so we've just made our appointment for a 4-year postdoc. The rest are all 3 years. So we're kind of looking, I think we'd quite like to get our postdocs in place as soon as possible. But there are timing issues. As I said, that we don't quite know when collections are going to be open. So at the moment, correct me if I'm wrong in summarising our discussions, that Stuart and we were both thinking of a sort of January start. Is that correct for our postdocs?
Yeah, January was the discussion point that we came to.
Yeah, I think Gary, you were kind of the same as well, right?
Yes, we're looking at January, and our position, I mean, each university is slightly different. We're trying to get some, excuse me, some coherence among the group. Our stage is that we're going through the HR, applying to the university to say that we're appointing someone, that we've got the funds for doing it. And once we've got that, then we're ready to go with an advert.
Right.
The same with the PhDs, and I think we would like to do it, I think, as a group and get it out on what's it called, myphd.com or findaphd.com, etc., etc.
Okay, and then I think the one that's perhaps the most, I'd say, problematic is yours, Andrews, because we don't know when your collections might be open. And have you got a recruitment freeze at the moment or anything like that?
No, we haven't got a recruitment freeze.
Okay,
it's just
great.
that our HR people don't have access to the office.
Okay.
We're hoping that will improve in the second half of August, and then it'll depend on other recruitment priorities for the organisation. But I'm working on the job description and person spec, and that has to be approved first. Yeah. So if we can get that done, we may be able to forge ahead sooner than I expected. But it's hard to say at the moment. I can't give it a firm time for that.
But in general, I think our intention is that the positions would be starting in January, and we will be advertising to appoint them as soon as possible. So it might be that, I mean, just like theoretically, we could be having interviews at the end of August for a position that we know starts in January.
That is what I'd like to do at Roehampton, certainly. So yeah, get them out there. We won't, I can't see that we will start at Roehampton. It's a group decision. Before January, because I don't think there's much point having people sitting around not being able to talk to each other. But we would like to get the advert out, people appointed, ready to plunge in the bright new dawn that is 2020.
Excellent. Are there any more questions? We've just clicked over to 1 o'clock.
There are no more in the chat, but please, if there's anybody else who wants to ask a question, now's your time.
Or, just get in touch via email or direct message us on Twitter or something like that. So I think in that case, just huge thanks. Let's just quickly wrap this up then. So as I said, follow us on Twitter, because we will be having a website quite soon, but at the moment, this is the place where we'll be sharing our news, and any job adverts, we'll be advertising them via this Twitter feed. Yeah, we'll advertise them there. So Ginny and Sharon, they start in early September. And I think as soon as they start, that's when we'll start getting our kickoff meeting for the research network. So if you've joined because you're interested in being part of this project, do get in touch so that we can add you to the list of people that we want to kind of involve in the broader research network. And I think, again, because of COVID, we'll kind of make this up as we go along, depending on how the situation changes. But, I think at that meeting, that's going to be the really key one, which really shapes the rest of the project. But as I said, and have been saying all along, we're just really happy to collaborate with anybody who is interested in this. It's a super cool project. We're so lucky to have been supported by so many amazing people to pull this together, and we just kind of want to do more of the same. And it's so great that you've all been involved and asking so many questions, and let's just, you know, see this as the start of something that is going to be much, much bigger into the future. So I think let's call it a day. Huge thanks from everyone, certainly from me. Guys, do you want to say goodbye as well?
Yeah, goodbye.
Thanks, Naomi.
Yeah.
Thanks for chairing as well, especially while we're all flailing around getting the hang of the technology. But thanks everyone for coming, and do get in touch.
Indeed, you can find our email address. Personally, I'm happy to answer any questions about the anthropology project. Just send me an email.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks for all the interest in the chat and the questions. It's been really great.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, in that case, I think it's time to sign off. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Angela, if you want to stop the recording, and just enjoy the rest of your day. The weather looks glorious. All right. Bye.
Bye.